Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Marc LiVecche and Mark Melton, for scintillating conversation about three topics from this week. Firstly, an interview with Hal Brands of American Enterprise Institute, his perspective on U.S.-China strategic competition. Secondly, Mark Melton will tell us about his interview with Robert Nicholson on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And finally, we're going to look at an interview with prominent pastor and author Brian Zahn's views on war and peace. He is a Christian anti-violence advocate.
Not a pacifist.
Not a pacifist, as he insists, and as we'll dissect later. But firstly, Hal Brands from AEI, and also teaching at Johns Hopkins, wrote a very good piece for AEI on regime realism in terms of how the U.S. addresses China. I found it very helpful in that Hal Brands is not a strict realist nor idealist, but rather believes that for reasons both realistic and ideological, the U.S. is in competition with China and would be no matter what, because of what the U.S. is as a democracy, which he believes is intrinsically threatening to the regime in Beijing. He also is optimistic and believes that the U.S. has the internal resources to outlast and to outcompete with China, and also notes that China, for all of its bluster, is a regime often lacking in confidence, as dictatorships often do, because they never quite know where they are with their own people in a closed society. So, Marc LiVecche, as a Christian realist, what is your response to the regime realism of Hal Brands?
Yeah, that was excellent. I appreciated the interview immensely. I think what he's describing in his qualified endorsement of realism is at least some version of what we are putting forward in Providence. Realism is great. Realism is not enough. You have to have the moral component to it, and he recognizes that. So I think that's wonderful, and that dovetails nicely with our own aspirations. I think his push for the ideological conflict that exists between the United States and China is essential. I think ideology very often gets underlooked. I wonder how much, in some ways, our own dedication to a liberal order scuttles our ability to recognize that ideology actually can really run very deep and is sometimes not compatible with competing ideologies. Sometimes a conversation cannot work these things through. They run too deeply. They are too defining to be easily dismissed. This came home to me. I'm writing this book, Moral Horror, on the bombing of Hiroshima. And I was reading just about some of the early conflict between Japan and China in the early 1930s. And there was a historic footnote about one of the things that China did to try to prevent the Japanese from infiltrating deeper inland when their army was beginning to overwhelm the Chinese army. One of the things the Chinese nationalists did was to bomb the dikes of the Yellow River in order to flood great swaths of the land and prevent Japanese egress into the interior. And the footnote to all of this, and it was a horrific event, of course, because it killed probably at least 500,000 Chinese, but it did prevent for a time Japanese infiltration. And the historic footnote to this, I think, touches on what Hal Brand talks about. And it's that the Yellow River was always seen as both a great good, but also a potential calamity for the Chinese, in that it was prone toward flooding. And whenever it would flood, it would kill and devastate. It would kill millions or many and devastate great swaths of the land. Therefore, the Chinese government had to take a central and authoritarian role in maintaining the structure of the dikes. They couldn't rely on local constituents to do so. It had to be centralized. And it contributed to an obsession with control, because if the dikes failed, they would flood. Therefore, the government would be seen as failing and the government would fall. And so this idea that for hundreds of years within Chinese society, this propensity toward a centralized commanding control over the land and the people ran deep, and just beginning to recognize and recognizing the benevolent component of this. If we want to protect our people, not just our hold on power, we have to have this centralized, obsessive, authoritarian control. If it runs that deep, it's going to matter in current national politics. And so I think his underlining that is provocative and incredibly necessary. You're on mute.
I was muting the helicopter flying overhead, no doubt surveilling me. But as I understand hardcore secular realism, it tends to minimize ideological differences between regimes and imagine there are these intrinsic interests to all nations, regardless of regime. So Hal Brands challenges, quite rightly, that perspective. Mark Melton, tell us about your chat with Robert Nicholson about the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Right. So I talked with Robert Nicholson earlier this week, and the podcast dropped yesterday, talking about the latest war in Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh, if I'm pronouncing those words correctly, between that territory and Azerbaijan. I think a lot of our listeners probably know, if you follow us on a regular basis, about the conflict there. But for those who don't, this is a territory that has been part of Azerbaijan. Global community recognizes it, but the territories, the Republic of Artsakh declares its own independence, and I think the Republic of Armenia recognizes it, but Azerbaijan did not. Starting in September, or actually earlier this year, conflict resumed, and last week, the parties signed a peace treaty brokered by Russia that basically gives a lot of territory to Azerbaijan's control. And this is a pretty dramatic loss for the Armenians. And like I said, we've run multiple articles about this conflict already, but in my conversation with Robert, we did a little bit of a deeper dive, talking about what does this mean for Armenians? What does this land actually mean to them, both historically? They have a lot of monasteries there, and also, I think there's a lot of strategic loss there. Like when you look at maps, which if you go to the podcast page, I show the maps there, and it's very difficult. I mean, they're going to have to build some new roads to the mountains so that this territory can sustain itself without the Azeris cutting them off. Right now, Russian peacekeepers are going to be in the area. They're going to be kind of spread out, it looks like. I'm still waiting to see some more details on that, but they're going to be there for 5, 10 or so years. And but like if they go, then this territory, I think, could be under threat again very quickly. And so the Armenian prime minister is probably on his way out. I don't think he's officially out yet, but it's going to be very difficult for him. And meanwhile, Turkey, I would say, has gained a lot out of this. We ran another article by Walter who says that Russia is the big winner. I'm kind of mixed on that opinion, but there's lots of hot takes on that on the web that you can look up. But we talk about that, Nicholson and I, about Turkey's gains out of this, because basically Turkey and Azerbaijan wanted to change the status quo, and they did. And that is the essence of geopolitical power. I know Ian Bremmer kind of said last week that this is an example of a G0 world, where Armenia had a lot of support, soft power support in the global diaspora, and yet it failed them. And because Turkey and Azerbaijan were able to use their military power. And I think part of this military power was also the use of drones that really countered the Armenian strategy. And so this is going to be a new world order that we're starting to see more and more of what I think the new world order is going to be for the next 20 years in this conflict. And because I think it's some testing grounds of what strategies might work going forward.
Very good. Thank you, Mark Melton. And then finally, taking a look at this interview I had with Kansas City area pastor Brian Zahnd, who is a fairly well-known author in Christian circles and a prominent advocate of Christian nonviolence, which we would call pacifism, which he prefers to call opposition to war and opposition to violence, because he does not want to be passive. But essentially, he recounts that he became a nonviolence advocate after the Persian Gulf War and during the Iraq War, under the influence, unsurprisingly, of Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder. Interestingly, his caveats, as opposed to others in his school of thought, he does support violence in terms of law enforcement, but he thinks violence militarily is on a scale that should be unacceptable to Christians. So, Marc LiVecche, you are a just war scholar. What is your response to Brian Zahnd and his Christian arguments for nonviolence?
Yeah, I appreciate that you did the interview. And just a note, I don't think the interview's on Providence, right? It's over at IRD. Juicy Ecumenism.
Yes, it's at IRD's Juicy Ecumenism blog, but we're discussing it because it is central to themes of Providence.
Looking for it, which they should go look for it. It's over there. I'm unconvinced. I hope that doesn't surprise anybody. Thoroughly unconvinced. I've never understood, and I'm glad that you tapped at it to try to get him to explain it. I've never understood this distinction between how it's okay for the police to, in the last resort, draw their weapon and fire, and somehow then, nevertheless, it's not allowed for soldiers to do the same thing. I've never understood that. I'm not necessarily accusing Brian Zahnd of this, but at root, that seems awfully sort of self-serving. Like, really good that we live in this particular zip code where we have a generally well-functioning society and we can have a police force that protects us. But when you look abroad and you see innocents being trampled, can't do anything about that. And it's really a shame to be you in a malfunctioned society. So I've never understood that, frankly, the Christian charity that could propose that arrangement. That seems uncharitable. I appreciate his distinction that pacifism is not passive. He's right. A lot of people will try to make that claim. And to their credit, the Claibornes and the Hauerwasses and the Zahnds, they try to do a great many things to support and to promote the common good. But at some point, and this always struck me as the central dilemma of pacifism, at some point, if, as C.S. Lewis said, if all good people are pacifists, then eventually we're going to live in a world where there are no pacifists. And why is that? Well, it's because the bad people, who will apparently run unrestrained, will eventually eat all the good people. So pacifism is ultimately going to be self-defeating. I don't believe that soul force, or like best intentions or prayer, are ever going to be sufficient in this world to prevent the wolves from coming after the sheep. History doesn't bear that out. Any recognition of the disposition of the human soul doesn't support that claim. It seems rather that the just war tradition, operating in the same insistence on last resort that Brian Zahnd insisted the police exercise, the just war tradition, better than pacifism, accounts both for the conditions of history and the disposition of the human soul. It looks for that which is the most reliable, most efficacious, most proportionate, most discriminate, most efficient means that is also the most rights respecting for the largest groups of people to protect the innocent, to take back what's been wrongly taken, and to punish evil. That's been the tradition that the Christian church and the Greco-Romans and the Jews have been able to utilize. And I think Brian Zahnd is on shaky ground when he dismisses that. I've said before, it's never a question of nonviolence. If you ask me if we can promote the common good through violence or nonviolence, and both are equally effective, I'll choose nonviolence every day. But in fact, it's not the conditions of the world that we can choose between violence and nonviolence. The just war tradition, Christian realists, are reactive. We never launch into new acts of violence. Violence has been launched, and we have to respond to it. So at the end of the day, as I've said before, I think pacifists are only committed to not exercising violence themselves. They don't seem to be willing to exercise violence to protect the innocent. So in the pacifist scheme, the only people who use violence are the evildoers. And that is not charitable. You're on mute.
I tried to make the point that some understanding of just war was common to every major tradition of Christianity, and to depart from it was to essentially to depart from the ethics of ecumenical Christianity.
Absolutely.
He, of course, argued that it was not intrinsic to early Christianity,
Right.
which he insisted was pacifist, but the historical record on that is very sketchy.
Right. No, thoroughly agreed. And we've had, I think most recently, J. Darrell Charles trounced that view in the pages of Providence. There's an article I think is still up on the main page. People can go look at. Your invoking of Peter Leithart's Defending Constantine was apt. That book has not been refuted. It's far more complicated than the simplistic purity of the Christian church pre-Constantine, and then Augustine comes along and screws the whole thing up in order for Christians to be relevant and maintain power.
It's the mythology of so-called primitive Christianity.
It's a mythology both of primitive Christianity, and it's a Marcionite refusal to recognize that we are a Hebraic faith. And so, if you cut out the whole Hebrew Bible and you cut out the New Testament, you look at a very mythologized view of the early church, maybe you can come up with what they come up with, but it's bad scholarship. It doesn't work.
And of course, we at Providence firmly stand against Marcionism.
Yes, sir.
All of its forms.
Not Mark is
no,
but Marcionism.
Marxism is the exact opposite of Marcionism.
But
fellow Marks,
okay.
Fellow Marks, Mark Melton, Marc LiVecche, thank you for another fascinating conversation. Until next week, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.